Okay, this is a quick video going over section 5.5 of your textbook, which was a reading assignment that you have for this week. I'm going to go over the presentation that is in PowerPoint and briefly go over some of the slides. However, you should take the time to read the slides and understand the information that is contained in the slides. So this presentation is going to go over, as I mentioned, information that is section 5.5 of your textbook. What we're looking at specifically is defining stress, vicarious trauma, and self-care. So we want to be sure at the end of this module that we understand the difference between stress, compassion fatigue. We understand compassion fatigue as part of burnout and trauma and vicarious trauma. We're going to explore the relationship between these things, stress, trauma, and vicarious trauma. And then we're also going to discuss techniques to reduce the risks of work hazards. And your book has these categorized and split into two categories, into two types of risks: stress-related hazards and physical hazards. Now, there has been a lot of information, hopefully a lot of information that is reaching the public to educate us on how dangerous stress is. And it is also helpful for us as workers to understand as employees that stress can affect our work and the way that we do our work. It can also affect us physically. It can affect us with our relationships at home, with friends, and so on. But it can also be something that causes you to not like your job as much. And when you find yourself in that situation, you'll notice that you don't work as effectively. And so we'll take a look at that a little bit more in depth as we go through the presentation, and you'll also be able to dig into it as you read these slides. So the two types of hazards that your book mentions in section 5.5 are stress-related hazards and physical hazards. And so with stress-related hazards, of course, that includes stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. And then with physical hazards, you are looking at environmental dangers. And then your book also has information on some of the regulatory requirements that are in place for healthcare workers, which you are going to be working in a healthcare environment, so you are a healthcare worker. So those regulatory requirements that are established to reduce risk and preventative measures that are in place to do the same, to reduce risk and to offer more protection to healthcare workers. It also has information on universal and special precautions that are in place and that you should be aware of in order to protect yourself when you are working in a healthcare environment. Of course, this is going to be different if you're working as a remote interpreter. When it comes to what you do to protect yourself, but it is information that you still need to know, as most interpreters, even if they do remote interpreting, at some point they will do in-person interpreting depending on the types of assignments they are offered. And so this is information that we all need to be aware of. And then we're also going to go through information about PPE, which is personal protective equipment. On page 287 of your textbook, you will find some information on what PPE is. So things like surgical mask, goggles, face shields, gowns, gloves, of course. And so there will be some information there to familiarize yourself with what PPE entails. But I have also included some videos that are going to be available to you on this module on Canvas, and the links are also available in the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so let's take a look at some of those hazards that are specific to interpreters and not unique to interpreters, but specific to our work. So driving, as you see, is my first point there. When it comes to healthcare interpreters who interpret for hospitals that are employed as employees, they will not be doing a lot of driving. However, that doesn't mean that you will not be doing a lot of driving. I'll give you an example. As an interpreter for Sutter, I worked for Sutter Medical Center here in Sacramento. I had to interpret for patients at the hospital, but sometimes, depending on the need, I had to, during the day, in the middle of my workday, drive to Sutter Center for Psychiatry to interpret there, which is about 3 or 4 miles away from the medical center. Now, at the time when I worked at Sutter Medical Center, we actually had 2 separate campuses that were not as close as they are now in downtown. We actually had Sutter Memorial, which was in East Sacramento, and then of course the Midtown location, which is on 28th Street, which we all are familiar with now. And so sometimes I would have to drive from campus to campus. But it's not as typical as it is for a interpreter who is either an employee of a vendor or it contracts with a vendor. Driving is a big part of interpreting for contractors and folks who work for vendors, because they are sending you to wherever the client needs you, wherever their customer needs you. So, for example, if you were to work for an organization like Language World Services who contracts with Kaiser, they may send you to do an 8 a.m. assignment to Sutter Roseville on Eureka Road, and then after you're done there, that your next assignment might be down the street in one of the Sutter Roseville clinics that might be within Roseville, but maybe 4 or 5 miles down the road. And then after that, they might need you to go to Kaiser Morse Avenue. So driving is one of the things that we know can come, if we are not safe drivers, can come with hazards. And so driving is one of the things that you need to consider as a source of hazard. And so you need to be sure that when you are driving, when you get behind the wheel, that you are being a safe driver, that you are insured, and that you are physically well enough to drive. That means you got enough sleep, you have had something to eat, and we'll talk about why that's important in other aspects as well. The other physical occupational hazard that I have listed there is strain injuries. You see this a lot with American Sign Language interpreters, where they are having to use their hands, arms, and neck quite a bit in order to communicate with sign language. And so repetitive movement or repetitive motion injuries could be common if you are not careful. So in that kind of interpreters should be taking care of themselves. They should be stretching. They should, again, be eating things that are healthy for their body to be as healthy as possible. And then, but that doesn't exclude us. We also have repetitive movement or motion strain injuries, which involves our vocal cords, because we may be interpreting for long periods of time, because we have assignments that involve a patient seeing one provider after another, and we're talking with all of them, and we're doing twice as much talking as everyone else is doing. Or you are interpreting for a simultaneous interpretation where possibly it is a class where you're teaching a patient about their illness or teaching them about nutrition information and things like that. And again, sometimes these classes are a bit longer and they have 2 speakers, but the interpreter is the only interpreter. So you're not taking turns with anyone while the speakers are. And then it could be also that you are doing interpreting that is back to back, one patient after another, or maybe you are doing over the phone interpreting and for some reason the connection isn't good and you're having to raise your voice. Whispering is something that is really hurtful to your voice as well. It really strains your vocal cords, and so doing chuchotage interpretation or interpreting where you have to whisper, again, is another way that you could make the risk higher of having this type of injury. And so that's why you need to take measures to protect yourself, like staying hydrated, like resting your voice. If you know that you have had an assignment or a day where you used your voice a lot, maybe drinking some tea or drinking something cold to help with the swelling. Those are things that you have to consider when you are thinking about self-care, which we will talk about during this module. So hydration and nutrition are very important. As we know, we have talked about this before, we know that our brain needs sugar. That's the fuel that our brain needs in order to work appropriately, in order to help us think better, in order to work through problems, in order to use our critical thinking skills. Our brain needs to be ready to do so. And the way that we get sugar, the way that we get nutrition to our brain is through our food. And so we need to be sure that we are eating foods that are healthy for our entire system. We don't necessarily, when I say that our brains need sugar, I'm not saying that you should be eating straight sugar just to feed your brain. The sugar that is contained in the carbohydrates and the other foods that you eat are going to be enough to nourish your brain. And staying hydrated is another thing that also, if you are dehydrated, can affect your thinking. It can give you headaches, you can feel lightheaded, and all of those things are going to be things that will affect your thinking and affect your performance as an interpreter. So you should be, as an interpreter and working in any type of work really, you should be conscious of making sure that your body is nourished appropriately, that you're eating foods that are going to be healthy for your whole system, so that you're not overdoing any of those monster drinks or things like that, making sure that you're actually eating food that is not going to make you crash later, or that make you sleepy, or make you be hungry immediately right away. You need to be sure that you're eating healthy foods and that you're staying hydrated, and of course that you're taking breaks, either to hydrate and to eat, but also to give yourself a break from the kind of work that we do, because I think that many of us and many of the people on the community, they think that, why are you tired? All you're doing is talking. But it is interpreting, as you know, is a very tiresome job. Your brain cannot rest. It has to listen. It has to do so many things. And we'll actually take a look at the things that happen with language transfer. And message transfer, what are all the stuff that our brain is doing, and it can be very tiring, so we need to be sure that we take breaks. All right, and then your book, the second type is environmental dangers. So the kinds of things that can pose environmental danger or external dangers, right, are going to be things like patients who pose a danger. And so what we mean by this is patients that might be confused or irritated. Sometimes we may interpret for patients who are actually there from prison or who are under arrest, patients that might be considered dangerous for whatever reason. And so that is one type of risk that we need to know how to what to do in those situations in order to lower the risk of it being a danger to us. And so with this situation, what you need to do is, if you, for example, ever find yourself interpreting for someone who is could be a possible danger, you will be notified by the provider. You'll also be notified by either your manager if you work for a hospital, if you're an employee, or by the agency that you work for. When you arrive, you will also note to see if anyone else in the encounter is taking precautions. You need to then for some reason, maybe I don't know, it shouldn't happen, but if for some reason you were not informed that you had to take certain precautions because this person might pose a danger, if you see others taking precautions, you should immediately ask what are the precautions that you should take and why you should take those precautions. Okay. I'm going to mention something similar when it comes to other types of precaution in wearing PPE. But in this case, if we are talking about patients who might pose a danger, and this might be nice people that have had a head injury and at the moment are confused. They don't know what they are. And so what happens in their system is they are in survival mode. And if they are confused, they don't know where they are, who you are, they might not be trying to hurt anyone. They may just be trying to protect themselves. If the provider knows that is a risk, they should let you know. They will let you know. They will let everyone know before they enter a room. And so you need to be conscious about the possibility that these things could show up as you're interpreting. There's for those reasons, for other risks, there exist regulatory requirements. Regulatory requirements are requirements that every single healthcare organization has to comply by, and they are laws. And so these kinds of regulatory requirements include things like wearing PPE, having certain training as well. So regulatory requirements are going to be something that we are going to talk about here. We'll talk about hand washing. We'll also talk about immunizations, which are part of regulatory requirements, HIPAA training, and things like that. When you start working for a healthcare organization, they are going to train you, give you this training. But for contractors, you may not have the opportunity to receive that from the organizations that you contract with, because as we have talked about before, when you are a contractor, you do not have an employer. You are your own employer. You're self-employed. And so you are the person that is responsible for making sure that you are informed about these regulatory requirements. So we're going to start with talking about immunizations. Immunizations are part of regulatory requirements. The requirements from hospital to hospital and clinic to clinic could vary. Some are more strict than others, but there are minimum requirements that everyone has to meet. And so while if you go to UC Davis, the regulatory requirements might look different than when you go to work at Sutter, they all have the minimum requirements in common. And the regulatory requirements are in place to protect you, but also to protect others from you. And that includes patients and the folks that you work with. If you see the word here, vector, and there's a definition of vector in page 284, which is a person, animal, or microorganism that carries and transmits any infectious pathogen into another living organism. And so that sounds kind of scary, kind of rude, or dehumanizing. But the reality is that we as humans, and we have learned this, if anything now with this pandemic, we do carry diseases, and we do have the ability to pass on or transmit diseases, to carry them and transmit them into someone else. And so these regulatory requirements, especially when we're talking about hand washing protocols, PPE, and immunizations, are made to protect us, to protect others from us, because we can transmit disease, but also we want all the other people around us to also meet those so that they don't pass anything on to us, right? So let's take a look at what some of those requirements could be. We might have already gone over these when we went through HCI 300, when I talked to you about doing internships or externships, practice hours during the second semester, doing them at a hospital or clinic. And we would have required these from you if we would not have had to switch to online. And so we require them because we were going to step into hospitals, clinics, and things like that have to meet these regulatory requirements. And then also the good thing from that is that you also, when you're ready to go to work, you already have these ready, right? So a physical exam, there are going to be many organizations that will ask you to do a physical exam. And the reason for that is they want to know that you are healthy enough to work in a healthcare environment. The next one there is varicella. And actually, I'm going to let you go through these as you read through the slides. You can look at what the requirements for vaccination or immunization are. What I will say is we'll talk a little bit about what a titer is. A titer is, for example, if you have lost your vaccination records, for some reason you don't know whether you received a vaccine or not, what you can do is you can have a blood test that checks your blood to see if your system is immune to certain diseases. So if you do a varicella titer, for example, what you do is you have your doctor draw some blood. They look to see that you have the RNA, that your immune system is prepared to fight against varicella if it would come in contact with it. That titer would say whether you're positive or negative. And what you want to be is you want to be positive, because that means that you are testing positive to having immunity to that disease. And so you see that there's varicella titers. You could do a varicella titer. You could also do an MMR titer, which would be for measles, mumps, and rubella. So you would, even though the vaccine that we get is one vaccine that fights against, it's what we call a cocktail, that fights against measles, mumps, and rubella. You would need a titer for measles, one titer for mumps, and one titer for rubella. So that's one way. If you don't have your records, don't worry about it. You, in that case, would need to go and get a titer to check for immunity. And of course, if you don't test, if your test comes back negative, then that means that you would need the vaccines. The other thing I will say is that the tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis vaccine, that one does expire. The varicella, measles, and Hep B ones, those, once you show immunity, you show that you received the vaccines once, that's it. You just need to keep that documentation. But the Tdap, which when we get it as children, we get the vaccine that's called DTaP. And then after, you have to receive it again. Now it's called Tdap, but again, it's still a cocktail for tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis. I believe usually you receive this when you are a child, and then you get it again when you are 13 years old. And then after you're 13 years old, you have to get it every 10 years. And the other thing that I want to mention here is about the flu vaccine. That is one injection for the current flu season. And so, as you know, every season or every year, we have what is called the flu season. And every year that vaccine is different. And so you need to make sure that you have received the current year's vaccine. Now, you see that I have COVID-19 question mark because right now, as part of regulatory requirements, it is a requirement that you receive the yearly seasonal flu vaccine. There are talks now that a COVID-19 vaccine is in the market. They are deciding whether they are going to make this part of the regulatory requirements for healthcare workers. And so you see that I have COVID-19 listed there. As for which one, whether it be Moderna or Pfizer's vaccine, at this point, neither one of them is considered better than the other. They're both considered equally as effective, or equally as acceptable. One of them is 95% effective, the other one's 94% effective. However, they're both acceptable because they both have a pretty high rate of efficacy. So, but what we don't know is whether they are going to be a requirement or not. It's looking like it could be, so that's one that we should keep in mind. And then last there, you see drug test and background check is very typical when it comes to working in healthcare. And for a drug test and background check, the drug test is usually a urine drug test, and a background check is completed. And depending on what kind of work you're doing, there are going to be different standards. Okay. So as I mentioned, when it comes to another type of precaution that we take in order to reduce risks and hazards to healthcare workers, we talked about PPE, which is personal protective equipment. And so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take a look at the videos that I have posted on the module. You can also get the links here in the presentation itself. What you will see is you will see a video on how to don PPE. So donning PPE, that means how to put it on up correctly. There's nothing that annoys me more personally than seeing someone with their nose out of their mask, or watching somebody put their mask on incorrectly, because what it's doing is it's giving you a false sense of security and that you don't have. And you are rendering this PPE that is very important and that is made to protect you and protect others. If you do not put it on correctly, it's giving you a false sense of security and it's doing nothing for what you're actually putting it on. So why bother putting it on in the first place? And then doffing PPE. Again, this is how to correctly take your PPE off. So make sure that you take a look at those videos. And then the third video is about leads. Leads are going to be those lead aprons or lead vests that we use when we are going to be interpreting or when we are going to be around anything that requires radiation. So radiology, mammography, anything that uses radiation in order to perform a task, in order to perform a procedure. You will need leads. This is going to be in heart catheterization, anything that uses fluoroscopy, MRI, things like that. And so what I will say about leads and PPE is that you have to, and this will be on the quiz, you will be responsible to, whenever you are going to enter a room, you are going to be responsible for taking a look at the door, and the door is going to have the information about what kind of PPE is required in order to enter those rooms. Okay, so if I am going to interpret for a patient for these providers here, and I see that they are wearing all of this protective gear, oh, you better believe I'm not going to walk in there without anything, right? So one way of making sure that you are protected and that you are using the correct PPE that is necessary is by taking a look at what the other providers are wearing. Now, a lot of times what happens is folks think that, okay, well, you're not going to touch the patient, so you don't need gloves. But if the requirement to enter the room is gloves, you need to have gloves, even if you're not going to touch the patient. one of the things that you need to remember is that viruses, bacteria, and diseases, pathogens, they spread in various ways. You might have heard a little bit more about this, especially right now when talking about COVID-19, because one of the things that we needed to know first is how it spread. Did it spread in the air? Was it spread through droplets? Was it able to live on surfaces and things like that? So sometimes, even if you're not going to be touching the patients, you should be wearing gloves, because if the type of pathogen that we are trying to protect against is a pathogen that can live in surfaces, if you drop your pen or you touch a wall that the patient has touched, if you touch a table or anything like that the patient has touched and could have possibly infected, now you might now have come into contact with that pathogen. So yes, we don't ever touch patients, but we still need gloves to protect ourselves and also to protect others, because if we walk into a room and we do not wear gloves and we come into contact with a pathogen, now we are taking it with us outside of the room. Right? So what you need to know for the quiz is you are going to, first line is hopefully, or they should let you know, the providers should let you know that you are going to be going into a room where where precautions are necessary. The other thing is that you are going to have to take that responsibility upon yourself, right? So you need to, one clue is to take a look at what the providers are wearing, how they are protecting themselves, and ask if you should be wearing the same thing. And then the other way that you should know is you are going to be looking at the door that you are going to be entering. So if you're going to be entering a patient room, an examination room, wherever the area is that you're going to be, where the patient is as well, you are responsible for looking at the door. And if you see here in the slide here, I have different types of doors so that you can become familiar with how these type of information is posted. So you can see, for example, typically what is going to happen is if there are requirements for PPE, that PPE is either going to be hanging from the door, like you see on the top one here with that yellow hanging thing that has the gloves and everything that you need to wear it before going in. Or it may be in a cart that is next to the door. The other type is if you see off to the right where you see the patient is in room P005, UPMC, you see that that's kind of a nifty, those are a bit more expensive in the hospitals, where they have these in every single room, and then the nurses are responsible for pulling out the pulling out the tabs that have the information about what kind of precautions are necessary. If you look over to the left hand corner right here, you see that here they're actually using signs on the door. And so it's telling you that you must take COVID-19 precautions because the patient is COVID-19 positive. And then on this one here, you see it says, do not enter without proper PPE. All who enter must be approved by site manager. And then it's telling you that you should have maximum precautions. And with maximum precautions, you are then going to have to know what maximum precautions are. And that's going to be mask, goggles, face shield, depending on what kind of face shields they have, and gowns. So you are going to then, and here's the thing is, if you don't know what maximum precautions mean, or what they mean by the precaution, your job is to make sure that you notice the precautions and that the nurses can then tell you what to wear. You're not responsible for bringing the equipment with you. You're not responsible for bringing the PPE with you. So the healthcare organization where you will be, the clinic, the hospital, wherever you will be, there responsible for giving you this PPE that is required. So even if you're not clear on what is meant by maximum precautions, you're going to have to talk to the nurse, have her clarify it for you, and then also let you know how to get it, or where you can get it. Or a lot of times they get it for you. And then over here in the corner, you see the contact precautions. It's another kind of sign that you will see. The regulation states that it needs to be posted on the door. That's the regulation, right? So you see all of these signs are door signs. What it doesn't say is exactly how, but it does say that you have to do it. So the reason I mention that is because these signs, as you see here, might look different from hospital to hospital or clinic to clinic. However, they will always be at the same spot by the door. Okay. All right. Stress-related hazards. And what we are looking at here then is some key terms that have to do, key terms and definitions that have to do with stress. So the definition for stress is defined as a state of mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or demanding circumstances. And the other medical definition that you should be aware of that we might have already been using for trauma, I want you to be aware that there are two types of trauma, or things that we refer to as trauma. So if you look over at this definition here with a green circle there, it says, in a medical or biological context, stress is a physical, mental, or emotional factor that causes bodily or mental tension. So we might have previously referred to trauma as a concept for physical harm. Over to the right here for the last definition, it says stress can initiate the fight or flight response, a complex reaction of neurologic and endocrinologic systems. So when you feel stress, even if it's not physical trauma, nothing has hurt you or bumped you, nothing has cut you. Those are all types of trauma, right? So a cut, a bullet wound, being bumped by something, even when that hasn't happened, there is still physical things that happen in your body, because when you are stressed, even if it's emotional stress or mental stress, your body reacts to that in a certain way. We'll talk about also good stress and bad stress. So I'll have you read these slides yourself. I'm going to skip over to the next slide here, physiology of good stress. So what we're looking at, why are we saying that stress is good sometimes? What we're saying is that stress allows us to perform better because it makes some of those hormones that make us more alert. Stress produces cortisol, which improves memory and enhances your immune system. Okay. Stress increases the level of adrenaline in your body, which increases strength and endurance. It also provides a spike in blood pressure, which sends more blood towards your muscle and brain. And of course, that is going to increase the amount of oxygen that your muscles and brain are receiving. So that is good, right? But in the previous slide, I said, well, that it can also harm all of these things. And the reason is, just think of that concept of everything should be in moderation, right? Even ice cream isn't good if you have too much of it. So if you have an adequate amount of stress, at a certain point, these hormones can be helpful because of all of these things mentioned on the slide. But if you have too much of those, if you're constantly flooding your muscles with blood and your brain with blood, what's happening then is you only have a certain amount of blood. And so what's happening now is that your other tissues are now, because we're sending so much of it, we're constantly sending so much of that blood to the brain and muscles, your other tissues are not getting enough. And so it can harm the other tissues, right? So that's why too much of that isn't good. And so the same thing with the other types of hormones. Too much of them cannot possibly be good for you. So you don't want to have too much stress. What you want to do is you want to learn how to cope with situations that allow you, and those coping skills will allow you to reduce stress or to mitigate stress, right? To deal with stressful situations without needing to have this process continuously happen in your body. About coping skills and learning coping skills, learning how to deal with things in order to reduce stress, I wanted to have this slide here for you so that you can see what kinds of things can happen, but also how preparing yourself for those things, how a big part of mitigating or dealing with stress and avoiding to be overloaded with stress is preparation, being prepared. So here are some examples that can happen when you are interpreting. So the first one is you show up at an encounter and another interpreter claims that the assignment belongs to her, not to you, and tries to argue with you about it. I'm going to give you a bit more background to make the stress clear here. If you're an employee, you're on the clock, you're being paid anyway, whether you're interpreting or not. But most interpreters are going to be interpreters who are working for vendors or are contractors. And so let's say that this assignment was actually scheduled for 4 hours. And so you have, on your schedule, made yourself available for these 4 hours. And so you might have, for example, found a babysitter. Additionally, you are now expecting that you are going to make 4 hours worth of salary because this is a 4-hour appointment. But now this interpreter is saying, nope, you have to go home. Your babysitter, you just wasted that, and you're not going to get paid for these 4 hours. Now, what I do want to clarify is that in your contracts, typically, if there is an assignment that you have and it gets canceled, it can get canceled for various reasons. It can get canceled because the patient doesn't show up. It can be canceled because the patient maybe was supposed to be fasting, but they didn't fast. It can be canceled. A doctor, or a clinic or whatever, they can have their own reasons. They might have double booked or whatever, and they need to reschedule the patient. The doctor might have called in sick, something like that. And in this case, in this example, it could be canceled for one interpreter because there are actually 2 interpreters present. And so in your contracts, you will have the rules for what happens in this case. So you can be prepared by knowing, okay, so this is a 4-hour assignment. What happens if it gets canceled for whatever reason? Well, my contract says that I'm only going to get paid for my travel time and the first hour. So while I was expecting my travel time plus 4 hours of pay, now it's only travel time and 1 hour of pay. That can be stressful. Or 2 hours of pay, and still you were expecting 4. That can be stressful, but you can reduce the stress because you can at least know the rules. Instead of, what happens now? This is going to get canceled. Or it might get canceled. In addition to the stress of this confrontation, I don't know what my contract says. So you can lower that amount of stress that would come with the situation by knowing your contract. Okay, the other thing that you can know is, well, you're not just going to leave because this interpreter said so, right? There's going to be protocol or rules that are established on what to do when this sort of thing happens. It's not very common, but what do I have to do when this happens? You should know that. And that, again, is going to help you. That preparation with that information is going to help you reduce that stress, right? So those are 2 things you can do to help in this situation. The other thing that you can do is you can remain professional, and you can remain respectful to that interpreter, to the patient, and to the provider, right? And that's going to also help you reduce stress. Now, I can't promise you, no one can promise you that the other interpreter is going to remain professional. I can't promise you that the provider will not be upset, and I cannot promise you that the patient won't be confused or upset. So those things we can't do anything about, really. What we can do when we can't make them not be upset. We can't do anything about how these people are going to respond. But what we can do is we can remain calm. We can choose how to react, and choose to react in a way that is not going to make this an even more stressful situation, right? So it could be that you have to call your organization and ask, okay, what's going on? What should I do? And then they can help you clear it up. And the other interpreter could be wrong, and you might be staying and actually getting your 4-hour assignment paid for and completed. That could be one possibility. The other possibility is that, oops, your organization was wrong. And they say, oh, we're going to pay you the minimum. We apologize. It was wrong. That's what the contract says that you can expect, and you are working with that understanding. But that doesn't mean that just because they are right, it feels good. We are still stressed. We still drove all the way over here. We still found a babysitter or whatever. And so what we are going to learn with the self-care plan is that there are situations that we can, some situations where we can do something about eliminating stress, and other situations where we don't have a choice. Stress is going to be there, but then we have to come up with some coping skills on how to deal with that stress. And so in that case, you would have to deal with that stress, and we'll look at what are the different ways that are recommended to help you deal with that when we get to the self-care part. Okay, the next one there is a client snaps at you for misinterpreting something. And yes, sometimes this happens, and things get blamed on the interpreter. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and it does not feel good when it happens. And it can be hurtful. But again, what are the things that you can do to reduce stress in the situation? Well, you can be an interpreter who is well prepared. You can be an interpreter who works on their vocabulary, who works on their memorization, who works on being transparent, who works on effectively mediating and intervening, and an interpreter who does her job right. That sense of sureness in yourself is going to help you a little bit when and it has happened to me where I have been interpreting, I'm doing great, nothing's wrong, and a patient says, that's not what I said, or that's not how you say it. And I go through a process. I look inward and I say, did I make a mistake? I don't think I made a mistake. So I'm not going to get offended because I know that I didn't, right? And then I'm also going to react in a professional way and try to say, what I do is there something that you would like me to repeat once again? And so give them the opportunity to say it one more time, and then I will interpret it again. If you feel, what I'm saying in essence to the patient or the provider is, if you feel that it was incorrectly interpreted, let's do it again. I'm not going to argue with you whether it was right or wrong, but okay, let's just do it again, and I will do it again. I'm going to choose how to react, right? And so what we're doing with this is we're already helping ourselves with these stressful situations. We are becoming aware of that these things can happen. And then now that we know that these things can happen, we are learning about what are some things we can do about it when they happen. And this is going to help us reduce the stress in these situations. The next one is if the provider repeatedly won't let you finish what you are trying to interpret. Well, in this case, again, I'm going to be a prepared interpreter and think about chapter 2 of what I learned in my interpreting program of, okay, if someone's not letting me finish interpreting, what are the choices that I have? I'm going to take a look at the situation, and I know that I have several choices that I can do, and I'm going to evaluate which is most appropriate in this situation. So if a provider repeatedly doesn't let me finish, my choices are I can ask for a break as the interpreter, so I can intervene and remind the provider that they please allow some time for me to do the interpretation. The other thing I can do is I can go into simultaneous interpretation, right? And so I can do that instead. If the provider says, you know what, no, keep up, and they are not allowing me to give the interpretation in a consecutive way, and if they are choosing to go too fast, and maybe there's more than one person, and I am not able to simultaneously interpret for how quickly the information is being delivered, then another thing that I can do is I can intervene one more time to say the interpreter is going to now go into summarization instead of a complete interpretation. And so I can then be transparent about what I'm doing, and I can say, okay, this is what I needed. It's not happening. That's cool. That's your choice. But let me tell you then now that in that case, I need to do a summarization. And that way, everybody knows that you're doing a summary. I'm being transparent, but I'm not arguing with the provider, right? Because if I start arguing with the provider, no, you have to speak slower. You have to give me pauses. I cannot make that person do that. What I can do, is let them know, hey, if you don't let me do this, this is what's going to happen. You're not going to get a complete interpretation. You're going to get a summarization. And I'm going to say the same thing to the patient. And so then if the patient doesn't say anything, at least they are choosing to allow that provider to get away with them only offering you a summarization. So that is something that you can do. Now, is that still stressful? Yes, it's still stressful because you might be feeling a certain way because you think personally inside that it'd be better to give a complete interpretation than a summarization. But again, those are our feelings. That's our bias, and we're not going to let it affect the situation. We're not going to let it add more stress or more frustration, more confusion to the situation. All we can do, because we cannot control the provider and we cannot make the patient insist on a complete on pauses to allow for a complete interpretation. We can't do either of those things. All we can do is be transparent about it, and that's going to help us lower some stress because we know what to do in these situations. And then again, another thing that's going to help us lower that stress is knowing that we are performing our job the right way. We are proceeding with the correct protocol. So that's going to help us reduce some stress, but stress is still going to be there. And again, that's when we are going to look at our self-care plan to see how we can cope with the stress, but it's not going to be as much stress as it would be if we didn't know about the different choices, and if we didn't know about going into summarization, and if we didn't know about being transparent. All right, the next one is the assignment doesn't finish on time and interferes with your next assignment. This is something that is more common than the other situations that we discussed. And again, that it is going to be stressful. You're going to have some stress, but you can reduce the stress with knowing what the protocol is here for what you should do when this is happening. And so that is going to be informed to you, or you're going to be informed of that policy, what you do in this kind of situation by your employer. Different employers or even contracting agencies will have a different protocol to deal with this situation, and a way that you can reduce the stress from this situation is by knowing that protocol ahead of time. All right, I'm going to let you read a little bit about trauma and how it can affect a person. What I'm going to skip to now is the trauma-informed care slide. Trauma-informed care, which is also known as TIC or TIC, involves a broad understanding of traumatic stress reactions. So involves a general, so you don't have to be an expert in trauma. You don't have to be a psychologist, psychiatrist, but it does include a general understanding of how trauma can affect a person, what some reactions can be from a person that has gone through trauma. And the reason that we are going to be learning about trauma so that we can be sympathetic or empathetic of the people that we are serving when we are working with patients that have gone through trauma. You can read there about how trauma affects patients. And again, what I will say is that this is very important because we need to know what are some things that we might expect. It's a way to know like why some patients might be rude or why some patients might be tired, why some patients might cry. So it's preparing ourselves to know what kind of environment we're working in. So you can see there that I have some slides that have information about what trauma looks like and what some of those symptoms might be. Now, we're going to talk about stress-related and occupational hazards and trauma as how it can affect us, how our work can actually cause trauma to us. So I'm going to start off with this slide here. The slide here has information that we have seen previously in chapter 2 of our textbook. We learned about how interpreters actually do interpretation. So we called it message transfer skills, right? And so if you go to page 102 of your textbook, where they have listed these 4 things as 4 steps, your book actually calls them listen to the message, extract the meaning of the message, find equivalents, concepts to reformulate the message in the target language, and then you actually deliver that message, right? And so if you take a look here, here's that cycle. And I have not done it in steps like 1, 2, 3, 4, because if you think about it, when we're interpreting, we don't just do once. This 1, 2, 3, 4 is for every single sentence, every single utterance, every single thing that a person says, right? And so I have it in an infinity shape here because we're doing that over and over, right? The doctor says, good afternoon, Maria, nice to see you. Okay, we have to listen to that, analyze it, convert it into the other language, and then say it in the other language. Maria then says, it's nice to see you again, doctor. I wish I would have not be seeing you in such a tough situation, but it is still nice to see you. Okay, now we have to listen to that, analyze it, convert it, and deliver it. And so we're going back and forth, doing these 4 steps over and over. I started off by saying that in this section we were going to talk about how one of the risks to us as interpreters is trauma and stress. So vicarious trauma is what vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue is going to be actually something that is exasperated by the fact that this is how we work, by the fact that everything that is said, we do 4 things with it. For example, a patient says, my head hurts, and when I go to sleep, the headache goes away, the light makes the headache worse. We're not really feeling the headache, and that's something that we can expect, that we know that is maybe typical kind of information that we interpret. However, there are going to be situations, depending on the kind of interpreter that you choose to be, the kind of interpreting that you choose to do, also the kind of organization that you end up working with, where you might be working with patients that have had things that are bad happen to them. And so think about when you were watching a movie. You're watching this movie and something sad happens, and a lot of times we cry, right? Just hearing it and picturing it, we cry. But when it comes to interpreting, we're actually even doing more than that. Somebody says, when I was 5 years old, I was molested by a neighbor. Now you have to interpret it. So you have to listen to it. You have to hear it. You then have to analyze it. And you have to then, when it comes to analyzing it, we are extracting the meaning of it. You have to memorize it. And one of the things that our mind does, and one of the things that we have learned here in class, is the way that we can memorize things is by picturing them. So now that sentence that the patient says, when I was 6 years old, I was molested by a neighbor, you're not only hearing it, but you're now also picturing it. You're analyzing it. Then you are converting it into another language, and then you are saying it, and you might be saying it in the first person. And so in this case, it can be internalized by the interpreter. Things like interpreting for victims of rape. If an interpreter, for example, might be called to a hospital for a patient that was assaulted, and an interpreter is called to interview the patient either by the hospital staff to know where to examine, but also by police. And they might be asked, things like what you were doing. I was walking to my car, like coming outside of a grocery store. A man grabbed me by the hair, threw me down to the ground. A man repeatedly punched me in my face and my torso. He then kicked me to the ground, and then he raped me. And so all of those things that we are having to interpret, we're listening, we are picturing it, we are analyzing it, we are converting it in another language, and then having to repeat it. And those things can actually affect us as interpreters ourselves, even though that thing didn't happen to us. The process, having to do that process with the messages that we interpret, means that we are the only person in the room who is cognitively processing that information at least 4 times for every sentence or every statement that is made. Additionally, when we interpret in the first person, when we're using direct speech, it means that for neurological as well as linguistic reasons, the interpreter can start to feel as the content is personal to them. For that reason, when we looked at using direct speech, using the first person, we did take a look at some exceptions. In page 96 of your textbook, it does say that there are exceptions to interpreting in first person. It mentions that when you're interpreting something that might be horrific, the book actually says when you interpret horrific content such as rape or torture. That is one thing that we can do to help reduce the stress or the trauma that interpreting this kind of language might cause. Now, I have this slide here. The reason why I have this information here is so that you know that the interpreter becomes transparent and nobody worries about the interpreter's feelings. And the better interpreter that you are, the less people are going to see you or care about you. Because an effective interpreter helps to convey meaning from one language to another. That is her basic job. But an excellent interpreter, a skilled interpreter, also succeeds at not at any point showing emotion, putting in their opinions, making a face, making sighing or gasping, right? They are effective at being transparent so that everything that victim is saying is communicated directly to the provider. They're effective at conveying only what is expressed by the speakers and or signers. And so we are effective at making ourselves invisible, and then that in turn makes other folks forget about us, forget that we are there. I say that because you have to be, again, at the beginning we said, be responsible for your own safety. And so today we are learning that those things can affect us, can affect our stress levels, might cause us trauma as well. And so because you know that this is a risk of your job, you need to know how to take care of yourself when after or during any of this kind of assignment. So one thing that we're learning is that we can switch to the third person. That's one thing that you can do to take care of yourself. And then again, employing our self-care plan. We'll look at others in a minute as well. So I sort of jumped onto vicarious trauma. So let me move on to here. What is compassion fatigue? Compassion fatigue is a syndrome that is a combination of the symptoms of secondary trauma. So secondary trauma is what we just finished describing, also known as vicarious trauma, and professional burnout. And we'll look at burnout in a second. It is a state of exhaustion where one feels depleted, helpless, and hopeless about work, life, and the state of the world. So this is something that is not going to affect only your work, but it can possibly, if you are suffering of compassion fatigue, also affect your life and your view of the world. Compassion fatigue is different from stress. It is something that is starts off with stress, but it's heightened. It takes place over the long term and drains you of feeling and caring. Stress over a long period of time without any rest can get you there to compassion fatigue. Burnout is a symptom of compassion fatigue. So let's say you have been interpreting in a hospital emergency room for law enforcement for a year, and you hear so many awful stories that you are now desensitized to them. You no longer care what happens. You're no longer shocked. And if you find yourself in that situation, you might be burning out. Burnout then attacks your empathy and compassion. It can also affect your motivation, and it can also affect how you feel about your work and your effectiveness of how you work. I'd like you to sort of think back. Many of us have come across a social worker, a teacher, a police officer, a cashier, somebody in customer service, a nurse, where they give you such bad service, or they have such a rough way of communicating with you that you wonder, like, why did this person ever become a teacher? She hates kids. Or why did this person ever become a social worker? She doesn't care about people. And what I want you to realize is that most of these people, they didn't think, oh, I'm going to go be a teacher so I can be a horrible teacher and make sure that all my students do terrible and just to abuse children. That's not how they started off. That is most likely, in most cases, going to be a sign of burnout. We talked about vicarious trauma. I'll let you read about vicarious trauma. The reality is that for us as interpreters, we may not have as much support as therapists do. We may not have the same kind of support that therapists do or that other healthcare providers do. Okay? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have support. It means that it's going to look different, and the resources that we have are going to be different. A lot of it is going to be self-care. And so what that means is that you are going to be responsible for coming up with that plan yourself. Okay? This slide, when you take a look at it, I want you to just note that differences between job stress and vicarious trauma. Again, realize that every job has stress, but once it starts affecting you more deeply, that's when it can be symptoms of something else. What we want to learn to be resilient. And resilience means that you are able, again, not that you're never going to go through tough situations, but that you have the tools to come back. You have the tools to cope with negative situations, process them, and then come back and be as effective, and be as and not be burnt out. So take on difficult challenges and still find meaning in life. Respond positively to difficult situations, rise above adversity, cope when things look bleak, tap into hope, transform unfavorable situations into wisdom, insight, and compassion, or endure. So when you are resilient, these are the kinds of things that you might be able to do in the face of adversity. So I'll let you read about what self-care is. Very briefly, I'll mention it's the ability to maintain physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual health in times of stress. Self-care is preventative care. So you should be aware of occupational hazards, which is the purpose of this module. And then you should also understand the importance of life-work balance, sometimes also called the other way, work-life balance, which is balancing the amount of time that you spend doing your job with the amount of time that you spend outside of your job, doing things like managing your relationships, dealing with your family and your family responsibilities, having time for doing things that you like hobbies and things like that. So knowing that you need a balance of, I need to work enough to be efficient at my job, but also leave enough time to do things that I enjoy, leave enough time to meet my family responsibilities and manage my relationships, right? So balancing it so that you're not giving too much to one aspect of your life while the rest of the aspects are suffering. In order to do that, you need to know your limits. You're going to live a healthy lifestyle is going to be very important to be able to even do any of these things. And then as an interpreter, you should know that if you ever need to decline assignments or say no to certain responsibilities, you should know how to say no because you know yourself and your limits. And then building a self-care plan, which is the assignment for this module. So we talked about preparing, right? That's what these are some things that you can do. Preparing with your skills, with your interpreting skills, preparing emotionally and psychologically to enter the job that you do, and then setting boundaries, drawing a line between your personal life and your professional encounter. So here are going to be some coping techniques that I'm going to ask you to take a look at. Visualization, other types of coping things, relaxation response, practicing relaxation. And then I am going to briefly mention a little bit about coping techniques and debriefing. With debriefing, it might sometimes be possible. Again, it is more likely if you are an employee of a hospital. You might have the opportunity to debrief with the nurse or the doctor, whomever the provider was. Sometimes the setup is actually some hospitals, and I've been a part of a couple of these where I interpreted for patients who passed away. One of them was very traumatic, where it was very quick. The patient was brought in a helicopter. The patient was a young boy. It was very hard for a lot of us to see this, watch his mom go through it and his siblings, and it just touched a lot of us. And so what Department of Spiritual Services did is set up a sort of a round table to allow us all to share our experience and talk about what happened. So that's one way. Another way that you could get that support in the hospital. If you don't work in a hospital, your vendor, if you're an employee, they might also have someone in the company that you can talk to. You might be able to talk to your supervisor about it and debrief with them. If you're a contractor and none of these resources exist, then you should consider your social support system. right? So family, friends, acquaintances, your congregations, if you're a member of a church, temple or mosque, other groups that you may belong to, and social activities that you may engage in. You will always, always, always have to remember HIPAA and privacy laws and confidentiality. If in any of these circumstances, even when you're sharing with your supervisor and manager, HIPAA and other privacy laws, as well as the part of code of ethics that says that we should keep information confidential. And so this means that, for example, if you had an assignment where a patient passed away, what you're going to do, let's say it's a patient that passed away, it was an oncology patient, you may have had many assignments with this same patient and it's now making you sad. What you don't want to do is say, feel bummed because I had been interpreting for this patient who had cancer and he was diagnosed in May and he didn't make it. He went through chemo, he went through radiation, but he just didn't make it and he died today. And I had to interpret to tell the family, and that's making me very sad. That's way too much information that you are giving that is protected information. What it could sound like instead is, bummed today, I feel blue because I had to interpret during an assignment and it was a very tough assignment. It's making me feel sad. It's making me feel sad for everyone that was involved. And I am just having a tough time processing what is going on. And that is what you can talk about is basically how you're feeling without giving information about the patient. Okay, so self-care, your assignment is to come up with a self-care plan. What I want you to understand, and 2 years ago, I had a student sort of, when we got to this module, she did it. She turned it in on time. She did a good job. But I could tell that a lot of students are like, ugh, like, what am I doing this? Like, I don't know what this is. I know what I do when I feel bummed. And I try to explain to the class the importance of actually writing down your self-care plan. And so, we had that happen. And then at the end of the semester, we were actually in the classroom talking about, I was having them share their experience during their practice hours. And this student who I knew she hated this assignment, she got up in front of the classroom, I really admired her for this. And she said, one of my least favorite assignments was the self-care plan. And she said, she was from her specific country, which I won't say. And she said, we don't coddle people like we do in the United States. I thought this was such a corny, crybaby assignment to do. And she said, and then the third week she was in her assignment, in her internship, she had to interpret for a patient that was going through something very difficult, and she was so sad about it. And she realized, she thought that she was tough enough. Oh, I can't, this is for people who are too sensitive. I don't need this. And then she realized how important it is. So I always, I wish I could have videotaped her saying that, and then of course asked her for permission to show it, because I think a lot of students really like this assignment, but some students are like, it's not for me. That's not how we roll in my country. Or that's not how I grew up. I'm not a crybaby, or I'm not, but you have to be ready for it. You have to be ready. I'm not saying that every single assignment is going to make you cry. Every single interpreting encounter is going to be sad. But when those do happen, they do affect you. And it's better to know that you have a plan than to not only be affected and be sad and then also not figure out how to make yourself feel better. So, take a look at that assignment. Please complete it. Please be thoughtful as you're completing it. The last slide here, I'm going to give an explanation just because it sort of might seem out of place. But when you are completing your self-care plan, think about the plans that you're doing, the types of things that you are writing down. Make sure that they are specific, measurable, appropriate action, realistic, and time-bound. This is what we call a SMART goal process. So anytime we're going to do something to respond to a situation, we should take a moment to say, is this the correct action? Is it specific? Does it meet the needs of what I need to do in the situation? How will I know that it actually is doing what I intended it to be? So how can I know, how can I measure the success? Is it realistic, and is it time bound? So I'm going to stop this lecture here, and hopefully you can continue and with the assignment, and hopefully this has been helpful with the reading as well as the self-care plan that you will be completing.